Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to our second legal philosophy seminar of this this term. Today we're delighted to have Professor Thomas Christiano of the University of Arizona, where he's Professor of Law and Philosophy. He's also the co-director of the Rogers Program in Law and Society, but currently a Lawrence Rockefeller visiting fellow at the Princeton University Centre for Human Values. He's also been a visiting fellow at All Souls College in Oxford, visiting fellow at the Research School of the Social Sciences at the Australian National University, a fellow of the National Humanities Centre in Durham, North Carolina, and a fellow of the Udall Centre for Studies in Public Policy. He has an impressive publication record. He's the author or co-editor of several books, including the following titles: The Constitution of Equality, Democratic Authority and Its Limits, The Rule of the Many, Contemporary Debates in Political Philosophy, Philosophy and Democracy, and Modern Moral and Political Philosophy with Robert Cummins. He's published several papers, mainly in moral and political philosophy, which focus on issues in democratic theory, distributive justice, and global justice. And he's now engaged in several current research projects at the Princeton University Center for Human Values. These are on international justice, the legitimacy of international law, legitimacy of international institutions, and human rights, of which today's paper will be a taste of his current work. Our respondent today is Professor Stefan Sciaraffa, who is assistant professor at McMaster University. Professor Sciaraffa works mainly in the philosophy of law, social and political philosophy, and moral philosophy. He's received degrees from the University of Texas, the School of Law. He's practiced law from 1997 to 1999. Completed his PhD in philosophy at the University of Arizona in 2007. He has some recent publications in the philosophy of law, in Law and Philosophy, in the European Journal of Philosophy. And in the past, actually, Professor Sciaraffa and Professor Christiano have co-written some work together. But today we've carefully designed our seminar so that they'll have to disagree to some extent. And so we'll not be able to rely on each other for single answers to questions. At least they won't be able to agree just yet. To see if agreement emerges later on. So please welcome, join me in welcoming Professor Christiano to Osgoode and York.
Thank you. Well, thanks for inviting me to present this paper. Maybe we'll give people a chance just to sit down for a second. So it's okay if I walk around? So what I want to share with you today is some of the thoughts that I've had about in trying to think about the legitimacy of international institutions. What makes, or what could make international institutions legitimate, and in particular, to what extent do principles that underpin democracy, can they help us in figuring out when international institutions are legitimate? So first let me say just a few words about legitimacy. So what do I have in mind by legitimacy? And the notion that I have in mind by legitimacy is that a particular body or a particular decision maker has legitimacy or is a legitimate authority to the extent that when it gives directives to various either persons or other entities, they have duties to comply that are based on the fact that the directive has been made by that authority. So legitimacy is a very special characteristic, and it's a very unusual characteristic in some ways, because it means that some people can impose obligations on other people. And the question is, how can this happen? How does this work? And when can it be justified? The function of legitimacy, as I see it, and we're talking here primarily about a moral notion. So the function of legitimacy is to, as it were, be able to make decisions for a group to make decisions in a centralized fashion, at least on some issues, such that even when lots of people disagree with them, they think they have good reason to go along with the decision. So the function of legitimacy is, in some sense, to deal with the problem of disagreement. Obviously, in the case of international institutions and what international institutions tell people to do, there's going to be a lot of disagreement on whether that's the right thing to do or not. So it makes a big difference if we can think of international institutions as legitimate or not. And that's why I'm thinking through this question about the nature of legitimacy. Now, I want to say just a few words about the standpoint from which I'm going to be talking about this idea of legitimacy. Broadly speaking, the standpoint is one of a kind of moral cosmopolitanism. What do I mean by moral cosmopolitanism? Moral cosmopolitanism is the idea that the basic norms of justice that apply to persons in particular circumstances, actually the scope of their application is global in character, ultimately. The thought is, the case of cosmopolitanism, there's a sense in which, and this will have to be modified a little bit when we start talking about legitimacy. There's a sense in which the basic duties of justice that we owe each other are ultimately owed to all human beings. Okay, that's the cosmopolitan idea. Now, I distinguish moral cosmopolitanism from political cosmopolitanism, where political cosmopolitanism is the idea that, well, what we want is a world state or a world political community or something like that. You can be a moral cosmopolitan without being a political cosmopolitan. The other, and this is sort of an angle from which I'm approaching these issues, this is why the title of the paper is Democratic Legitimacy Possible for International Institutions? My interest has been to try to see to what extent democratic principles can provide a basis for thinking about the legitimacy of international institutions. I mean, most of my work until now has been on theories of democracy and theories of democratic authority, and so I'm sort of trying to see to what extent they can be used in the context of international institutions. Now, there's one other piece I want to put in place just as something to flag here. When we're talking about the legitimacy of international institutions, of course, the main question we're asking in some sense is a moral question. You know, when is it the case that an institution or a decision-making body in an international institution can actually impose moral obligations on other people? We're asking a moral question. But we're asking this kind of question while we're asking this question, we have to keep in mind the fact that we're talking about a very special kind of entity, an entity which in general has not been the subject of discussions regarding legitimacy very much in the past, and that is international society and international institutions. Traditional discussions of legitimate authority are generally connected with the state and state political institutions. And they, usually there are various assumptions that are made when people talk about state legitimacy and the legitimacy of political authority about how the state functions, about what it does, what it's capable of, what its structure is, and so on. a lot of discussion, makes a lot of presupposition about some of the features of states. One thing we know is that international society and the institutions of international society are not at all like states. And so all of the discussion that goes towards discussing legitimacy of states has to be really rethought in the light of an attempt to understand what the nature of these things are, these international institutions, and what the nature of global society is. We have to try to get a grasp on that. That's, of course, particularly difficult to do. Of course, there's a huge amount of disagreement. People in international relations theory, there are lots of different theories. In international law, there are a lot of different views about international society. But in order to get a clear grasp of the question, whether international institutions have legitimacy, we have to have a clear grasp of the nature of the animal that we're talking about, essentially. And to some degree, this paper that I'm presenting to you kind of articulates some problems that arise when we're thinking about international society and we're trying to think about what would make international institutions legitimate. These are problems that emerge because of specific characteristics of international society, at least as I understand them. And of course, to some degree, the way I understand them is somewhat controversial among international relations theorists and so on. Nothing is uncontroversial in this context. So that's, but it's, be nice to have if you have comments on my conception of how all this is working, I'm very happy to hear, the discussion and to discuss the issues on that subject with you. So, okay. Well, let's sort of, again, step back a little bit to the sort of moral standpoint. So in contemporary political philosophy, there are really, I think, this is probably too strong, but I'm going to say it anyway, three main contenders when we think in terms of how to assess the legitimacy of political institutions. There are three principal contenders. The one contender is the idea that, well, an institution has a right to impose duties on people to the extent that those people have consented to that authority. They said, yeah, okay, I'm willing to be subject to that authority. Let me, and then once they've consented, then they have an obligation to go along with whatever commands there are. That's a very straightforward and clean picture of consent, and it plays a very large role in discussions of international law and international relations. And we'll talk about that more later. The other one that I think is of great importance now is the idea that political institutions can be legitimate to the extent that they are democratic, where democratic means, roughly people have equal votes, they have equal opportunity to participate in discussion about policy and so on. They have equal opportunity to play some role in forming the agenda for discussion. There's significant competition between different types of views. The thought is that if a political institution makes decisions democratically, then everybody in the context has been treated as an equal. And in the light of the fact that there's disagreement about everything, the thought is going to be people have reasons to go along with a decision that's treated them as an equal, even if they disagree with it. Because after all, we know that disagreement is a natural feature of political societies. So consent and democracy are two prime notions of legitimacy in contemporary thought. A third one, which I'm not going to spend much time on, is a much more instrumental view, which is, well, the institutions are legitimate to the extent that the decisions they make are good ones. They're good decisions. They're instrumentally valuable in that respect. I'm not going to talk about that notion of legitimacy very much here. not because it's not an important one or uninteresting or anything like that, but because I'm trying to focus on, well, what kind of a notion of democratic legitimacy can we develop, which is, I think, consent and democracy actually are to some degree grounded in democratic principles. So I'm going to focus on those first two. Okay. Now, I'm going to say something very quickly about the idea of sort of the direct application of democratic ideals to international institutions. The direct application would be what we would do is we would say we want international law and international institutions to be created by global democracy, a global democratic system, where we might say have a global parliament, a global assembly with people who are elected to that parliament from constituencies in the societies around the world. They're not elected by states, they're not elected by groups of any sort, they're elected directly from constituencies around the world. And this is a kind of view about the potential legitimacy of international institutions that's had a fair amount of discussion, a fair amount of supporters in the last 20 years. Certainly since David Held's book, Cosmopolitanism and Global Democracy. I think that's the name of the book. It's a really interesting book, so I encourage people to look at it if you haven't had a chance to see it already. Now, what I want to say here is that there are some really fundamental flaws to the idea of global democracy as a set of institutions. Really fundamental flaws. And I'm going to outline just three of them that I think suggest a significant problem. One of the problems goes right to the heart of the justification of global democracy. One problem in the case of global democracy. Because the way I understand it, democracy is grounded in a principle that involves, in some sense, publicly treating persons as equals in a certain jurisdiction by giving them an equal say. So you got a lot of disagreement, and people are going to disagree about the substantive law and policy and so on. How do we treat people as equals in that context? Well, we don't just give one person or one group the capacity to make decisions. We allow everyone to participate as equals in the decision making. Now, on my view, the thought is that can be intrinsically just, an intrinsically just way of making decisions. Okay, but it's intrinsically just, I think, only under a particular set of circumstances. And the particular set of circumstances are where the people involved, the individuals involved who have this equal say, have, roughly speaking, and it can only be rough, equal stakes in the decisions. Okay? Not necessarily equal stakes in each decision, but equal stakes in the whole package of decisions that have to be made. I mean, I think in the contemporary nation state, for example, most of us have roughly equal stakes in what a nation state does because most of our fundamental interests are implicated by state action and by the system of law and education and so on that we participate in a political society. So there's a kind of rough sense of equality in the case of the nation state, at least many nation states, and so that makes it a prime ground for thinking, okay, so then maybe decisions should be made democratically because people have equal stakes in it. If people have very different stakes in a decision, if one person has very heavy stakes in a decision, another person has very low stakes, and you give them both an equal say, it seems unfair, it seems unjust in some way, because you're in some sense allowing one person to have an impact on somebody else's life, and not because it's having an impact on their own life, but just in some sense there's an asymmetry there, which is incompatible with the equality that underlies democracy. Now, what I want to say is in the international arena, we have massively different stakes in the international arena. So, I mean, there are a couple of different ways in which we can, you know, elaborate on that. But you know, one of the simplest ways is the ratio of GDP to trade for a particular society. For some societies, the ratio of trade to GDP is about 10%. Like the United States is roughly like that. About 10% of what people buy and sell is made in the is made outside the United States. About 90% is in the United States. Okay. Well, other countries have much higher export to GDP ratios. So something more like, you know, in some cases you get 50 to 60%. So some societies are very heavily invested in the international environment, and others are have relatively low stakes. There are lots of different types of instances like this, but my sense is that overall the idea that there's equality of stakes in the international environment is at the moment, and probably for the foreseeable future, not a likely prospect. And so one condition under which democracy is sort of intrinsically just seems to not to hold. There are two other problems I want to point to. The second problem is the problem of permanent minorities. So one problem that we see in nation states is the presence of permanent minorities, by which I mean you have an insular group and you have an insular majority, and their interests don't cross. So the majority can always vote its own way, and the minority never gets its way. That's what I mean by a permanent minority. We have this in some states. We certainly have it in the United States, certainly with indigenous peoples, I think. A lot of states that have this problem. But my guess is that at the global level, the problem is going to be greater. There are some things that might mitigate this problem, and I won't say much about it because Stefan's going to discuss those a little bit. But I still think there's going to be some significant problem. My sense is that democracy has legitimacy only when you don't have serious permanent minorities. Because then if you have serious permanent minorities, then you've got a group of people who in some sense, they have a vote, but they never actually have a say in what's going on. And that seems to me to defeat the underlying concern of democracy. And so it undermines the legitimacy. The third issue is the problem of, well, how should we describe this? The problem of civil society. You know, the big question for democratic theorists, I think, the biggest question, the biggest institutional problem, is how on earth is democracy supposed to work? I mean, if you think about most people in the society, how much time do they have to give to political questions? You know, you got an 8-hour job. You got a few hours taking care of your kids. You have maybe an hour or so to relax. What do you have left? Another hour, maybe, if you're really conscientious, a day for politics, and probably less, because politics itself is an extremely exhausting and difficult phenomenon. Okay, so for most people, participation in politics is a really low information activity. So then you wonder, how on earth does this work? Okay, and I think, of course, a lot of people say, well, that it doesn't work. But I actually don't think that's quite right. I think that we have institutions in our societies which are designed and which have developed over, in some cases, hundreds of years to deal with this problem. And these institutions are political parties, interest groups, the media, that spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make political issues comprehensible to people who spend maybe an hour or two a week, for the most part, on politics. How to make it understandable. How to make it something they can talk about and think about. Sometimes they do a good job, sometimes they do a lousy job. But those are the institutions, at least, that make politics possible for large societies. What I want to say is those kinds of institutions take a huge amount of time to develop, and there's nothing like that in the international arena. Nothing like that. I mean, even the European Union, which is probably the most developed transnational political system, has no mass political parties. Its interest groups are basically not mass political interest groups, except to some degree business interests, which, and as a consequence, dominate the system. And if it's not happening in the European Union, it's going to take a long time to happen anywhere else for a very long time. The consequence, though, I think, of a lack of these intermediate institutions is elite domination. That's the consequence, and it's a complete undermining of the whole idea of democracy. So my thought would be, if you tried to have global democracy, you'd have essentially elite domination, at least for the next few hundred years. This is just a variant, essentially, on Kant's worry about the world state. I mean, it'd just be very remote and very, and ultimately, I think it would be oppressive. So my thought here, from these three considerations, is that global democracy is not something that's in the offing for the next, probably a couple hundred years, I think. Maybe in the long run, it's a good idea, but for a while, that's not what we're dealing with. So we have to look at something else. So let's look quickly at an alternative picture based on the idea of consent. The traditional doctrine of international law and the legitimacy of international law grounds international law in state consent. International law is a system of treaties. At least a large part of it is. The largest part of it is a system of treaties. And to some degree also customary international law, and sometimes there's a doctrine of consent that goes along with that as well. But the thought is state consent is the basic source of legitimacy. And an international court, for example, when it considers whether a state is in violation of its obligations, the first thing it's going to ask is, did it sign the treaty that formed those obligations? Because that's the condition of legitimacy. So that's not true with all obligations. There are certain kinds of norms in international law which don't require consent, but we can talk about those more later. Now, state consent makes a lot of sense, at least certainly in traditional international law, because international law primarily was telling states what to do. That was primarily what the function of international law was. The thing is, in the contemporary period, it's not really only that. Now international law, trade law, environmental law, human rights law, other forms of law are becoming more and more invasive into the domestic political societies that are involved. And so the doctrine of state consent looks like it's not the right kind of doctrine, because what we want is we don't want states to consent merely, we want individuals in some sense to be consenting. Now, my thought is, well, maybe we can reconcile the doctrine of state consent with the current realities in the following way. State consent can, in some sense, perform a genuine consenting role for individuals if the state that consents is a really good representative of its peoples. Okay? So if you have a relationship of representation between the state and its people, then state consent may be, in some sense indirectly, the consent of individuals. Now it's going to be complicated because, of course, the best kind of representation, the only kind of representation really we know of, is democratic representation, which is majoritarian. So not everybody is always in favor of what the state does. But we do know that in the most democratic states, that when states make treaties, they have to make sure that a lot of interests in the society that are affected by these treaties are aligned behind these treaties. So in highly democratic states, we've got something like the proper kind of relationship between state consent and individual persons. So it looks like what we need is, highly representative states. We can talk more about the nature of that representation because there are a lot of problems in the main problem with contemporary states is that their foreign policy establishments are still pretty secretive, and they're not very democratic. And of course, some people think that's a good thing, particularly when it comes to international law. But at the same time, it looks like what's going on then is that you've got elites imposing law on their own citizens that they have no say in. And when this international law starts to invade domestic society a lot, then that's a serious issue. So there would have to be some serious reforms even in relatively democratic societies to make this idea work. There's another idea, though, another issue which is a big problem, which is the problem of, how should we call it, asymmetrical bargaining or hard bargaining. Basic problem is very simple. State consent is compatible with powerful states essentially taking deeply unfair advantage of weaker states by saying, take it or leave it. If you leave it, you're screwed. If we leave it, well, it's not so bad. So we'll withdraw if you don't give us what we want. Admittedly, you only get a little bit, and we get a lot, but that's, hey, that's life. That's a very big problem. We see the formation of the United Nations even is infected with this phenomenon. But the formation of the WTO and other major and powerful political institutions in the modern world are formed with this kind of background in place. The asymmetry primarily works with wealthy states and poor states. It's interesting, it doesn't so much happen between big states and small states if they're both roughly similar. So, well, of course, maybe people have a different view of this, but at least the readings that I've done of the negotiations between the United States and Canada is that people don't generally think that, well, it's just like totally asymmetrical bargaining. But I may be wrong about that, so if I am, you can correct me. So that's a huge problem because, of course, we live in a world where you have spectacular differences in wealth between societies. Now, of course, in contemporary domestic societies, we have this danger that could occur also. But the danger is to some degree modified in domestic societies in a whole variety of different ways. First of all, the state usually provides a kind of social minimum for everybody so that nobody's in they're not supposed to be in totally dire straits. They don't feel forced to make agreements that are not very good for them. Second of all, courts tend to throw out really disproportionate contracts, what in the U.S. is called unconscionable contracts. But of course in the international world we don't have anything like that. We don't have courts that can throw out contracts like this. The Vienna Convention on Treaties just avoided this issue completely. And so there's no real presence there of any institution that could mitigate this effect. Now, of course, maybe what we could do is modify the notion of state consent and say, well, what we want to have is fair voluntary association among states, among highly representative states. So you get legitimacy if you get fair consent, or consent under fair background conditions, in which case it's hard to see how legitimacy is going to happen very soon now. But there are still problems here because it's hard to see how you can bring about the fair background conditions without really powerful political institutions to do it. But of course, we've already abandoned the idea of a legitimate, central, powerful institution, namely global democracy. Or do we have any alternative? And here we look like we're at a kind of an impasse, because it's like, well, global democracy doesn't work in virtue of a number of features of the international system. Fair voluntary association, well, maybe that would work, but it would only work if they had a powerful political institution to support it. So we've got this kind of strange impasse in legitimacy. I want to mention one other thing. I mean, actually, it's an important thing. The traditional view of treaties, I think in international law, and certainly among international relations theories, is that treaties are something like contracts. Okay, they're contracts between states for mutual advantage, and so on. In some words, even my discussion sort of suggested that it was like contract making. But I want to say that, in fact, treaties should not be modeled on contracts, because treaties have a very different function from contracts. And this, again, is connected to the fact that treaties don't take place against the background of a powerful political institution as contracts do. I think primarily when we think of contracts, like when I go to the store and buy something, or I go and borrow money from my credit card, all these are contractual arrangements. We're thinking primarily that all the parties are self-seeking, essentially. I do this because I think it'd be better for me, and the other person does it because they think it'd be better for them, and so on. And that mostly works in political society. And we accept the possibility of purely self-seeking activity in contract making because we think that many of the, well, we hope, is different in different societies, but I hope that at least many of the most fundamental concerns of justice are already in some sense met by the state. So the state is providing a social minimum. The state is providing public education. The state is doing all these very large-scale collective activities that are meant to, in some sense, ensure equality of opportunity, to ensure a reasonable distribution of income, and so on. And we think, okay, so in that context, it's fine that, I just seek for my own, I go for my own interests and you go for yours, as long as citizens, we vote for policies that achieve these larger collective goals. But of course, when you think about it that way, there's nothing like that in the international realm. I mean, it's not like we're making treaties for mutual advantage against the background of a larger system of institutions that's ensuring collective justice. That's just not happening. And it's not in the offing either. So it seems to me, and we'll talk more about the reasons for this, but I am going over time already. It seems to me that we have to think of treaty making in a very different way from contracts. And that is, and this has been observed all the way back to the first great Western theorists of treaty making like Grotius and Vattel, which is that a lot of treaties are concerned with establishing justice. Well, obviously human rights treaties are like this. They're in some sense, they make law in very much the same way that domestic systems make law, with, in some sense at least, the idea, if not fully carried out, the idea that they're trying to achieve a kind of justice in the society. That's what treaties do. That's not what contracts do. Contracts are sort of assuming that you've got the basic background conditions okay, and now you can just go for your own interest. The function of treaties, at least a lot of treaties, is to actually bring about a kind of justice. Now, I'll have to say what I mean, and you'll probably ask questions about this, by function here. What I mean is the morally appropriate aim of treaties in this context is not the same as the appropriate aim of contracts. It's just a different type of animal because we're dealing with a different kind of environment. So this also means that the ways in which we're thinking about treaty making and so on has to be revised. Treaties are not just matters of mutual advantage, but involve a deliberative characteristic, which is quite foreign to the standard ideas of consent and voluntary association. So with all those observations, my thought is the two basic models of legitimacy that we have, democracy, consent, are not applicable to international institutions, which means that we need another one if we're going to have one at all. But that's an impasse that I haven't gotten past yet. I think we probably need a different model of what international society is that distinguishes it from the kinds of models that are appropriate in the case of democracy and consent. So unfortunately, the conclusions of my paper here are primarily skeptical and primarily express the hope that we can develop some further notion of legitimacy. Anyways, I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. So my response to Tom's paper is written. I'll go ahead and read it. It's brief, and I tried to write it in a conversational tone, so hopefully it won't be too unbearable. So Professor Christiano has provided us with a rich and complex assessment of whether international institutions can achieve political legitimacy from a cosmopolitan standpoint. According to Christiano, legitimacy from the cosmopolitan standpoint requires that subjects of international institutions have a say as equals in the making of these institutions. He considers two main international decision-making institutions that might confer such legitimacy: global democracy and a system of voluntary association between democratic states. Christiano is not sanguine about the prospects of achieving cosmopolitan legitimacy of international institutions through either of these arrangements. As he puts it, the two central ways in which group decisions come to be legitimate in domestic societies are not in the offing in the case of international collective decision-making. Democracy and voluntary association are both problematic from the standpoint of justice and legitimacy when in the context of international decision-making. Here I briefly review Christiano's arguments for this conclusion and try to situate them in his theory of democracy. I register agreement with his conclusion about global democracy. This seems a particularly unpromising path to cosmopolitan political legitimacy. However, I suggest that the main problem for this route is the problem of information processing that global citizens would face, and that the other two problems that Christiano poses may not run as deep as he suggests. By contrast, I think I'm more sanguine than Christiano is about the possibility of achieving cosmopolitan legitimacy through a system of fair voluntary association, though my optimism measures the arc of international cosmopolitan legitimacy in scores of years or perhaps even centuries. This leaves us with the consideration of what kinds of justification are available with respect to international institutions in the meantime. I briefly mentioned what I take as the most likely candidate: the limited justification that comes with an ability to solve international coordination games and international games of partial conflict. To be sure, such justification falls short of the gold standard of the cosmopolitan ground of a right to rule. Nonetheless, achieving this lesser degree of justification would be an important achievement and is, perhaps, a more immediately realizable ideal. According to Christiano, international institutions can enjoy cosmopolitan legitimacy only if their subject citizens have a say as equals in the making of these institutions. To understand Christiano's thought here, it is helpful to situate it in the context of his theory of the value of democracy. According to Christiano, democratic procedures are intrinsically valuable only insofar as they advance the interests of their subjects equally in a public way. For Christiano, the formal allocation of equal votes to the citizenry and also opportunities to run for political office and that sort of thing is not enough to legitimate a democratic process. Rather, it must be the case that allocating such equal votes and equal political opportunities equally advances the interests of the democracy's citizens in a public way. Christiano enumerates three problems that undermine the cosmopolitan legitimacy of global democracy, so understood. The first problem concerns global citizens' unequal stakes in the outcomes of international lawmaking. Such inequality of stakes undermines democracy's claim to advance the interests of each equally in a public way. For giving each an equal vote with respect to issues that have an unequal effect on each seems a manifest failure to advance the interests of each equally. However, I am not so certain that this is as deep of a problem as Christiano suggests. Christiano observes that individuals within modern states live in a common world with others in which the fundamental interest of all are implicated. By contrast, individuals in different states are not mutually affected to the same deep extent as the lives of members of a single modern state are. Christiano adds that his interests as an American citizen are more bound up with interests of other persons in the U.S. than they are with persons in China or even Canada. And that would be true if Christiano was in, say, lived in Wyoming or North Dakota. However, I wonder how much of this is due to the fact that effective political institutions bind citizens' interests within states, but not across them. Perhaps effective global democratic institutions would similarly forge a common world across current state borders. For example, if democratic institutions developed that were capable of making and enforcing international laws governing trade, carbon pollution, copyright, crimes against humanity, and so on, there would be a kind of global common social world appropriate for democratic regulation. The second impediment to the cosmopolitan legitimacy of global democracy is the problem of persistent minorities. Persistent minorities are recurrent losers in a system of majority rule. A democracy plagued by such minorities does not advance the interests of each in a public way, rather it manifestly stymies the interests of the members of the minority in favor of the majority. Christiano suggests that at a global level, the phenomenon of persistent minorities would be a more pervasive and intractable problem than at the national level. I'm not so sure. This is a difficult empirical matter, so I'm not so sure. However, one possibility is that rather than entrenching persistent minorities, such global institutions might dramatically increase the minorities' prospects for forging sometimes winning coalitions with other groups, thereby allowing them an exit from their status as persistent minorities. Some evidence for this is that persistent minorities at the state level in the United States have historically fared better at the federal level. The third problem is a problem of information processing. Christiano notes that busy citizens do not have time to process complex political issues from scratch, and hence must rely on institutions within civil society, such as labor unions, political parties, and interest groups, to help them find their way within these issues. Without such information processing institutions, citizens left to their own devices are ripe for manipulation by political elites. Though citizens of a democracy formally have equal votes, this formal equality manifestly does not advance their interests equally if this equal say is deeply uninformed. Thus, a necessary condition of democratic legitimacy is the presence of information processing institutions of civil society. The problem then with global democracy is that it is highly uncertain whether effective information processing institutions are likely to develop on the global stage. Christiano's worry that international civil society will never take root seems well-founded. The enormous size of the world's population, the vast geographic distances, and the cultural and linguistic diversity seem insuperable impediments to the growth of the institutions of an international civil society that would be needed to process the information for the global public so that they could not be readily manipulated. In sum, the prospect that global democratic institutions could ever advance the interests of each global citizen equally in a public way seems extremely unlikely. For even if unequal stakes and persistent minorities would not undermine the legitimacy of this form of international governments, it seems extremely unlikely that the international civil society requisite for such legitimacy would ever take root. It is worth pausing to distinguish and raise the following question. Is global democracy a worthy ideal for the design of international institutions? Because it does not hold promise as a means to give each an equal say, and because it seems likely that it would be a vehicle of elite manipulation, one might think that it is not. However, fully answering that question would require comparing alternative institutional possibilities. It may be that global democracy would be illegitimate, yet better than all other possibilities. So what about the other route Christiano considers? A system of voluntary association. Christiano's basic idea is that a system of voluntary association among democratic states might be able to achieve the ideal of advancing the interest of each cosmopolitan citizen equally in a public way. His thought seems to be that the citizens of a democracy that has democratized the making of foreign policy would have an equal say with respect to the relevant country's foreign policy. And this policy would include various positions with respect to potential agreements with other countries. By extension, the citizens of the democracy would have an equal say with respect to any treaty negotiated with other countries, insofar as the resulting agreement between the two countries was voluntary and fair. And if the citizens of each democracy have an equal say in this way, then there's reason to think that their interests are being advanced equally in a public way. However, Christiano questions whether an international system grounded on the voluntary agreement of member states would realize the cosmopolitan idea of giving each an equal say in a way that equally advances the interests of each in a public way. There are two main obstacles to this. One is the problem of highly unequal bargaining situations that leaves many states ripe for exploitative agreements. The rich and powerful states are able to extract unfair agreements from the weak and less powerful. The second problem is that many states fall far short of the democratic ideal requisite to the legitimacy of such an international system. No doubt, both of these problems run deep, and it is far from clear that they will be resolved. However, there is some ground for optimism on this score, at least if we take a longer-term perspective on these issues. Democracy is a fairly new institutional possibility, and yet enjoys nearly universal global appeal. Moreover, many of the world's countries seem to be moving in a democratic direction, if only haltingly and not monotonically. Christiano suggests a key ground for optimism about the second problem he describes, relative unequal bargaining position of states. Christiano suggests a key ground for optimism about the second problem he describes, though he doesn't recognize it as a ground for optimism. Namely, Christiano notes the near consensus among political economists that the main cause of disparities in wealth between countries is the quality of domestic political institutions. Though this is a deeply difficult problem, there seems no reason in principle to think that most states could not someday put in place good political institutions that would lead to economic development, which in turn would largely rectify the problem of unequal bargaining position between states. Also, it seems plausible that something far short of global equality could go a long way toward alleviating the problem of hard bargaining. Namely, a threshold level of economic development, irrespective of the relative wealth of other countries, might protect a country from the hardest of bargains. Moreover, there may be a kind of ratchet effect in that once a state puts into place institutions of a threshold quality, they tend to persevere. If such a ratchet effect exists, then there would be reason to think that problems of global poverty, inequality, and unequal bargaining position would lessen significantly over time. No doubt, global democratization and rectification of global poverty and inequality will not happen anytime soon. However, there's reason to think that it's possible over the course of a number of generations. Moreover, these are goods in their own right for which many actors at the domestic and international level have incentive to bring about. By contrast, the removal of the main impediment to the legitimacy of global democracy, the lack of international civil society, is not a good in its own right, and it is not clear whether any actors would have sufficient incentive to put these institutions in place. I should mention one final point that Christiano considers and rejects that has to do with dealing with the possibility of hard bargaining between states. Christiano notes that one way that the results of hard bargaining might be avoided is by putting into place global institutions that could identify and effectively overturn hard bargains. However, the problem with this solution is that there are no global institutions powerful enough to do this, and if there were, they would lack cosmopolitan legitimacy. For these reasons, Christiano rightly rejects this possibility. Note, however, that if the problem of hard bargaining were to diminish significantly, such institutions would not be necessary. The best hope then, and a hope that I think still remains, is that democratization and global economic development will progress to the point that the phenomenon of hard bargaining is no longer such a threat to the cosmopolitan legitimacy that a system of voluntary association among states could win. Where then does this leave us? As Christiano concludes, cosmopolitan legitimacy of international institutions does not seem to be in the offing anytime in the near future. Moreover, global democracy seems an especially unpromising means of achieving this form of legitimacy. However, it seems that there is a possible path to cosmopolitan legitimacy that involves democratization and the rectification of global economy and inequality. So we might view Christiano's theoretical conclusions as findings relevant to international institutional design rather than resigned pessimism of the prospects of international cosmopolitan legitimacy. Moreover, in the meantime, it would seem that a more limited standard is available to international institutions. Namely, do they provide the coordination necessary for the solution of international coordination games? Certain global goods, very important ones, can only be achieved via cooperation among the states. These goods include responding to global environmental problems, such as global warming, putting in place a wealth-enhancing international market, rectifying problems of global economic inequality, and dealing with and preventing genocide and crimes against humanity. To that extent, the relevant international institutions provide a solution. To the extent that the relevant international institutions provide a solution that improves the status quo ante with respect to these issues, it would seem that they would enjoy a limited form of legitimacy, the one short of the ideal of cosmopolitan legitimacy. Thanks.
So, Professor Christiano?
Should I use this microphone?
How do you want this one?
The clip on? I guess I'll, yeah. Well, these are great comments, so I thank Stefan for thinking these through. And I think he makes some nice recommendations about some of these issues. The one thing I think, and this is really, I think, an open question in my mind still, although I have sort of taken a certain approach to the question. So I'm thinking about to what extent is legitimacy of international institutions possible within the next couple of centuries? I mean, my guess is that, you know, within 500 years, we might actually have a legitimate global democracy where all of these problems are overcome. But to some degree, the question is, well, what can we do in the meantime, and how can we think about the legitimacy of institutions in the meantime in relation to the current circumstances that we face? And so, you know, you were saying that, you know, well, maybe fair voluntary association could be realized because poverty at some point could, you know, decrease to such an extent that you could get real fair negotiation between societies, and that, you know, societies could become democratic. In fact, well, the order, I think, was that you thought maybe they'd first become democratic, and then, given the good quality of the institutions, then their poverty will be alleviated. But I see that as a very long-term phenomenon, and I'm not sure that, I mean, to me that means, okay, so for the next couple of hundred years, I'm not sure what to say about democratic legitimacy. So that's one thing. The other thing that's, and this is I didn't mention this in my presentation, it's in the paper, but I thought maybe I should bring it up now. One worry about fair voluntary association that I have is that it still depends on this mechanism of consent, and what it permits is for states to refuse to consent to certain things, or to simply form associations with other states having very strong external effects on third parties. That's one of the characteristics of a voluntary association system. Again, in an ordinary domestic society, to some degree we allow that because then we think, well, maybe the state can come in and rectify some of this. We have a certain system of law that can, tort law that can maybe rectify some of this. But again, in international society, we don't have it. And if we have the requirement of consent, then we have no way to, we don't have a way of criticizing cases where states are consenting with each other but excluding third parties. It's not a sufficiently inclusive scheme. Let me just leave the comments at that because they're great comments, but it would be nice to open it up also to general discussion.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Christiano. Your topic has a special appeal for me. I'm a doctoral student who has just completed her dissertation on an enchanting topic, the evolution of the United Nations constitutional assistance from a historical perspective. And I have to deal with legitimacy when it comes to the United Nations constitutional assistance.
Right.
And you touched on an issue that I have raised in my dissertation.
Okay.
And I'd like to draw your attention. You spoke about international economic law and international environmental law and how invasive they are in domestic issues.
Right.
In this regard, I'd like to point you out that I argue that the United Nations, in providing constitutional assistance, sets two kinds of standards. One about constitutional content, and the second is about the way a constitution should be written. And so far as constitutional content is concerned, some of the standards are financial standards and which are implicit, and they come because of the dominant role of international financial institutions. And as you rightly pointed out, that these are, I like the way you said so nicely, spectacular differences in wealth.
Yeah.
So if the IMF tells Bhutan that Bhutan must write a new constitution, because Bhutan has never had a constitution, that it should write a new constitution which should have a market economy, which should have anti-corruption commissions. How could you call the UN constitutional assistance to be legitimate in those circumstances?
Okay. Right.
Your comments and observations would be really welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, no, those are, I mean, the IMF in particular is one of the institutions which is problematic from the standpoint of legitimacy. Yeah, so of course, this is a complicated situation, right? Because, there's a sense in which you say, well, of course, maybe you might think, well, it would be a good thing for Bhutan to have a democratic constitution or some sort of constitution that enables, broad participation and that facilitates an increase in prosperity for the society, and that in some sense could, in the long run, help contribute to a larger legitimacy of international institutions. I mean, this is where the case with the things like the IMF, there's something, there's a really interesting complexity here, because I sort of think, well, sometimes, of course, they make a lot of big mistakes, of course, but if some of their recommendations are good recommendations, then there's a sense in which you might think it's desirable for them to do this because this might promote the long-run capacity of these societies to participate as equals in an international system. But on the other hand, of course, the way they're doing it is deeply non-democratic. Now, a lot of economists have complained about this non-democratic feature of the IMF and the World Bank, saying that that's the source of the mistakes that they make about countries. And so it may be that the democratic rationale really should, again, well, how it would apply in the case of IMF and Bhutan is a little complicated, but presumably you'd have to say something like, you have to form some sort of system of decision making where participants from the country have a kind of say in how the whole process, what the loan program is and the restructuring program is. You know, how to do that, I'm not really sure, but so I'm afraid I'm not sure how satisfying my answer is to you. Does that make sense though? That
I sort of, in a sense, sort of not very happy. But I mean, you're entitled to your response. But what do you have to say about Professor Anichua's book, where she talks about market democracy leading to ethnic rivalries? So
yeah.
Market democracy doesn't really lead to prosperity or welfare.
Yeah.
How would you counter that argument? I'm just wondering.
I think that she's mistaken. Because she's not here. Well, I mean, here the issue is, what do we mean by democracy? And I think the kind of democracies that Chua refers to in World on Fire are not what I call minimally egalitarian democracies. They lack a large number of qualities that sort of a minimal democracy requires in order for it to work properly. And I think it's partly because of their lack of some of these qualities that they engage in, like Rwanda, in the kinds of catastrophic, well, I mean the genocide that they engage in. Because I think if you look at statistical research on what I call minimally egalitarian democracies, they are the best human rights protectors in the world among any kind of regime. They're very, I mean, it makes a massive difference whether you have a democracy that has certain important characteristics. The likelihood is that you're going to have a pretty reliable protection of human rights. If you have a democracy that doesn't have all those characteristics, it's not going to be much better than a dictatorship. But once you get at a certain characteristic, then it gets very good. So in that sense, she may not be wrong. It's just that one has to be careful about the word democracy. You might think that if you think of democracy very broadly, and you're including every society that has equal votes and has majoritarian decision-making, then I think she's right that at least some of those are going to could produce disastrous policies. But if you narrow the scope to include some more conditions on what a legitimate democracy is, then I think we can find a category of democracies, which is found throughout rich and poor countries, that is very highly protective of human rights. And so that's the answer to the Chua argument.
Okay, we've got a queue. If you could just
Pass the microphone around.
Oh, right, sorry.
Oh, right.
Okay, so we've got a queue, so just give me a signal and I'll write you down. I've got Francois, Sujit, and Danny. I can put it on the other side.
Is it me first or who's first? Okay, I'd like to take the opportunity of my question to thank Professor Sciaraffa for being here today, because how many days ago was it? 3 days ago?
3 days ago, yeah.
3 days ago, his wife gave birth to their second child, and yet is with us today, so thank you very much. Okay, I have two questions, comments. One is relatively minor, the other is broader in its ramifications. The first one is really trying to sharpen one of the points that Professor Sciaraffa made, which has to do with permanent minority. It seems to me that permanent minorities are only permanent minorities in relation to issues on which the majority, as such, agrees, and the minority disagrees, right? Whenever the majority disagrees, then there is space for certain of those issues to coalesce with the interests of the minority, and the minority to have something to say here in a valuable way. And it seems to me that, okay, in the context of a nation state, well, maybe these factions are very crystallized over a long period of time, but that in this international realm, the opportunities for disagreements might be greater, and for different kinds of alliances to emerge. And we have historical examples of that. The non-aligned movement, for example, made a big difference on the international stage, and not the most powerful states were involved in it. The second comment or question has to do with your insistence on starting with democracy and consent, right? You finished your article by saying that, well, really we hope, or you hope, that there might be some further argument for legitimacy that we could, use to fill in the gaps. It seems that you have certain premises that lead you to think that democracy is really, and consent is really where we need to start. On page 4, you say, you speak of non-democratic states, and you say, and yet their peoples are less well represented if these states do not participate at all. Now, I'm not sure that's true. There are many states who are whose leaders act directly against their positions are very detrimental to their population. North Korea, Burma, but also quote unquote democratic states like say Pakistan, which is ruled by somebody who's highly corrupt, using international aid to own purposes, which might lead donating countries in the future to give less money because they're scared of corruption in ways that are very, very, very detrimental to their population. Now, so why start with democracy and consent as opposed to starting with the premise that, well, we're going to look at non-voluntarist conceptions of legitimacy, duty to support just institutions, a kind of Razian normal justification thesis that when the institution is better placed, say because of its coordination ability, to give to provide a solution that people on their own could not arrive at or could not achieve, then we should go with them. And when these accounts are not satisfactory, then try to fill those gaps, perhaps with looking at more voluntaristic accounts of legitimacy, as opposed to the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
So these are my comments.
Good, thanks, yeah. Yeah, with regard to permanent minorities, I'm glad you asked that question because I didn't say anything about what Stefan said about it. I think there is something to what Stefan says, and what you were saying, which is, this is a traditional move and also in American political thought. James Madison, has argued that when you go to the federal level, you're going to get, coalitions between groups in different states, but within particular states, you're going to get these majorities and minorities. And of course, Edward Schatzsnyder argued this kind of thing as well. And I'm sympathetic with that. So my guess is that given the large number of different groups, I would think that the probability that you would have some groups just not playing a role still increases somehow, especially since they're very diverse. I agree that this is a kind of it's an empirical question, which I'm a little unsure how to answer. It's just that I'm thinking, given the great variety of different groups of persons throughout the world, it's hard for me to imagine that some groups wouldn't, in some sense, find themselves excluded. Now, so that's just a conjecture, in a sense, because kind of a probabilistic conjecture. The other issue, which is partly connected with Stefan's thing, is that if we accept the idea that, and I hadn't thought about this before, but I thought about this when Stefan was making his comments. If we accept the idea that a global civil society is an extremely improbable phenomenon, at least for large parts of the global population, then it seems to me that one of the major mechanisms by which coalitions across groups in different countries would form is undermined, because that's the way these coalitions are formed is through kinds of civil society mechanisms. And if you think, well, there's not likely to be that much of that, then it looks like, though in some circumstances these groups will form, at least the probability is going to be made problematic because one of the major mechanisms by which these groups are formed is not in place. And then given the diversity of peoples, it seems to me like it's just hard to imagine that there wouldn't be significant swaths of people who won't actually be part of a majority. But I'm not certain of that. So that's now. Oh, so the second about yeah. So one thing that I say in the paper is that, well, I'm not going to talk about more instrumental views about authority, and so in that respect, I mean, I haven't discussed in this context the ras or the natural duty type approach. Now, I mean, in part that's just the focus of the paper, but now let me see if I can at least give some reasons for that focus. One reason is that it seems to me instrumentalist accounts of authority. What an instrumentalist account of authority means is that you think an authority is legitimate when it commands people to do things and they do what it tells them to do, then you get the best results. It's not because they consented or because there's been democratic participation in making the decision. It's just that the outcomes are the best when the authority makes its decision. And there are fairly straightforward cases where we can imagine something like that. A lot of coordination problems sometimes are like that. But my worry is that in a world where you have such a diversity of peoples, that the extent of disagreement and diversity of interest and so on is going to make that notion of legitimacy just a theoretical notion, and in the sense that, well, you could see that, well, if this person were to tell these other people what to do and they did it, then the outcomes would be best from a sort of God's eye point of view. But from the point of view of all these people who don't have a say in what's going on, you might, and who have lots and lots of disagreements, they're all going to be saying, oh, no, I don't think this is the right thing to do, so I'm not going to follow this authority. And so and Raz, of course, accepts that his conception of authority is going to be piecemeal, but my worry is that you've got a huge amount of disagreement on all these different issues, the piecemealness is going to undermine the whole possibility of this being a genuine authority. That's one answer. A second answer is that I don't think that, at least for these sort of large-scale political issues, that authority without consent or authority without democracy is going to lead to very much good outcome. That's the worry is that the interests of those who are not in authority are going to suffer. The interests of that's the worry that I have, which is that, to frame it in a slightly different way, the thought is going to be something like, the only way to successfully realize Razian authority is through democracy or consent. That's the only way you're going to get reasonable outcomes. For me, that fits in with the account of the justification of democracy and consent that I have, which is that part of the argument for democracy is that it's important that people be able to have a say in things that affect them, because they know what their interests are, they know how to, and they can accommodate them with other people and so on. So that if you don't have it, if it's not democratic or it's not consensual, their interests are going to be left out. That's the worry that I have. So that's the reason for thinking, okay, let's see where we can go with the democratic and consent views, and see how far we can push these, and how, because I think those things are necessary for the most part, both from an intrinsic and an instrumental standpoint.
But then we're left with a world where there are human rights treaties that most people, to a certain extent, would agree with at a certain level of generality.
Yeah.
So we want to account for their legitimacy. So what are we left with? Is the project going to continue in a more democracy consent direction? Or could, by the back door, at this point, the instrumentalistic account?
Yeah, it could be that the instrumental account would come through. It could be that one of Stefan's suggestions, that you talk about, well, let's just talk about comparative benefit or comparative legitimacy, and so yeah, you can't get close to what we hope for, but comparatively speaking, this is reasonably good. Yeah, the human rights treaties are an interesting phenomenon. In a sense, there's a lot of agreement on them, but there's also something puzzling about human rights treaties, and that is they don't seem to have any effect. And you wonder why that is. I mean, the study after study of countries that have ratified human rights treaties suggests that it doesn't change their performance. The worst performers get worse. Sometimes a little bit, some societies get a little better, but overall it's been a flat line, essentially, in terms of human rights performance. That's at least the general observation, at least from statistical studies. So then you wonder, does this have genuine legitimacy? What's really going on with these things? But it's a good question, though.
So I have two questions. The first is kind of rudimentary, and well, first off, I really enjoyed your paper. It was super interesting. In terms of the first question, I guess I'm really interested to know how you, how would you reconcile this particular, I guess, formulation? Not all institutions have the same mandate nor aspirations. So how would you reconcile that in terms of international institutions? And my second question relates to, I guess, in terms of the overall paper. I take your point about global democracy. However, I think that the way you've constructed the binaries between consent vis-a-vis global democracy may not hold. And so what do I mean here? Well, I think you're being super generous in terms of voluntary associations and in terms of treaties. And what I mean in terms of your generousness is that you ignore, for your purpose, the history of treaties and where they come from. This I would extend to the ideas of nation states, which is basically premised on the Westphalian notions of governance. And here, I think what I'm alluding to, or what I'm alluding to, is the inherent structural biases that are built into the treaties themselves. So, in terms of the way international law was constructed from the 13th century to now, well, it was constructed by a particular community with a particular rationale for the way they wanted to behave, right? So I'm not so sure that the way you have built the argument, it would hold. And the example that I would use is the principle of effectivity, right, in international law. So an unlawful act can become lawful, and it becomes customary international law, and then it becomes codified. So, for example, occupation. The best example that I have is, the extension of the 1948 border in Israel-Palestine and the facts on the ground that have actually led to the change in the actual constitution of Israel itself.
Yeah.
So, anyways, your response would be.
Right. Yeah. Good. Not all institutions have the same mandate. So, are you thinking like, for example, the UN Security Council and the WTO and the IMF, and so those are different institutions and they have different mandates? Is that the idea? Yeah.
Or, for example, regional institutions, right? So the EU was created to prevent future wars. When the Atom Treaty was created in 1952, the players came together to prevent another 1945.
Right.
Or 1923
Yeah.
to 1945.
Yeah.
So I guess that's.
Good. No, I mean, so, I mean, in some sense, of course, when say not all institutions have the same mandate, that does seem to me to go against at least the traditional global democracy picture. But I suppose there could be a question about whether these particular institutions, like the Security Council or the WTO or these other institutions, could become democratic institutions, or at least partially democratic institutions. So my thought is that when we observe that these different institutions have different purposes, and they're not bound together in a single systematic unity, that does suggest the idea of international law as a system of a bunch of different voluntary agreements, essentially, where they consented to making the WTO and so on. And doesn't suggest so much the sort of global democracy type picture. Does that answer that question? Because that was an observation that you made, and I wasn't sure if that. Okay, yeah. Let's try the. I mean, the second. I completely agree with the idea about the history of treaties and there being inherent biases, and I mean that's part of the ideas of the paper, which is that I think the Security Council. I mean that's an obvious case, right? Security Council and the WTO have inherent structural bias. I mean they're right on their surface, right? So the Security Council, you have 5 countries that have a veto, and nobody else does. And why is it that way? Well, because at least 2 of those countries at the time said, in 1945 in San Francisco, he said, take it or leave it. And these other countries, they preferred to take it with less than leave it. Yeah.
I'm more interested in the binaries that you've created in terms of global democracy and then treaties and consent.
Yeah.
And you kind of put them, and you face them off against each other,
right.
One being more legitimate, one being not so legitimate.
Well, no.
And I would say that both are illegitimate.
No, yeah, I agree. So no, that's okay. So there are different views that are. So the global democracy, I think, is just highly problematic. We're not going to get it. It's not so much that I think it's illegitimate. It's just I don't think we're going to get it. I don't think the civil society institutions can be there. We've got lots of different problems. I mean, the equality of stakes problem is also an issue. But I think that the system of state consent as it's currently constituted, that's illegitimate. Because of the problems that, and then my thought is, okay, well, why is it illegitimate? And then you're saying, well, there are these biases that come about. Well, why? And my thought is, well, they come about because of 2 different things. Probably the main thing is because of the asymmetrical bargaining, right? So the thought is, well, the U.S., in the case of the Security Council, the U.S. and the Soviet Union said, you take our veto or you leave it, and that's the end of the game for you guys. And they didn't want to let it go. Or in the case of the WTO, the United States and the European Union said to all these other countries, look, we could do fine without you. Not great, but fine. But you can't do that well without us. And so you got to accept these terms which are more in our favor. I think that's a problem. I mean, that's, to me, is a kind of illegitimacy. And the thought of fair voluntary association is that you don't have this asymmetrical bargaining power. But of course, I'm still worried even about the fair voluntary association because I don't know exactly how any of that's going to come about. And also because I still don't know how problems of inclusivity are going to be solved. Because if you just have state consent, even if it's fair, you can still not make agreements with groups that are deeply affected by your actions. So I think I'm on your side. I mean, my thought is that we've got these two accounts, and neither of them are really going to work. We need to look for something else. And yeah, I mean, that's the...
Thanks. I want to ask first, so I agree, I think, with your conclusions, but I want to suggest perhaps a different reason for why they happen. So first,
Okay.
I'll explain why I think some of what you said was perhaps problematic, and then offer a different diagnosis. So I think first you're maybe a little bit too romantic about democracy within states and the lack of democracy outside states. So I'm now a keen observer of what happens in the U.S. and if you look at what happens there, many of the problems that you describe in the international arena, I think you could say exist there. So I don't know exactly how it compares, and you could say, well, it's still worlds apart. But in terms of many of the difficulties that you raised, I think they're there in many countries that we would consider the epitome of democracy. And then to kind of echo what Stefan said, that you could say, well, we'll never get perhaps something perfect, but as long as we're moving in the right direction, then it's better than what we have. And perhaps here the solution might be to say, just do it, instead of thinking of a solution. And here's the thought. You said, well, the difference between contracts and treatises is that contracts are engaged with relations between individuals, where treaties many times are concerned with kind of establishing with justice, not just with self-interest. And I thought, if we compare certain things or certain events that were initially considered as contracts before the emergence of the states, you'll find them being transformed with time into something that's not just a contract. And the thought that I had in mind is the Magna Carta, which, if you think of England before the rise of the nation state, then you have something not totally different than what we may have in the international arena. And the Magna Carta was a contract. I mean, I really don't know the history, but as far as I know, it was kind of a contract between the king and the nobleman. And then it, through time, got transformed into this, well, basis of the Constitution of England or the UK.
Interesting.
However, but I agree with you for the following reason, which is you mentioned three bases for legitimacy, but you don't mention one that I think is really important. Okay. It's one that liberal philosophers don't like talking about. It's the distinction between in-group and out-group, the difference that people make between us and them. And so much of what happens within, so much of the explanation, at least as an empirical matter, of legitimacy within states can be explained, I think, only through this. So why do Americans now are unhappy that jobs go to China? They should have been happy, right? The jobs going from a rich country to a poor country is something that kind of, from a global perspective, might be a good thing. Or why did the Chileans were happy to spend, I don't know, $20, $30 million on saving 33 people when they could have saved hundreds of people by investing the same amount of money in poor countries? And I suppose most Chileans were very proud of what their country did, because it was our people and the Chilean flags and everything. So the difficulty, I think, with global democracy or any kind of global institutions is establishing the sense of that we are all one group. So until the Martians come to attack, and then we see ourselves as all as one group, then I think there's this is part of human nature, which may be unfortunate, but this is a real difficulty that we're stuck with.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. This. So yeah, the issue of civil society and domestic political societies. I agree that it sometimes begins to look kind of bad. You know, the thing is that I mean, I think it is true that in the case of the United States, part of what's going on is partly a collapse of one of the political parties. The Republican Party is kind of, you know, although it's going to win, it's not controlling it. They don't. So what they're going to do when they take over the legislature, God only knows, because there's no organization of the Republican Party. So that's part of the problem, and that is, of course, always a problem with, you know, where the health of a democracy depends on these more informal groups that, you know, they're not constituted by law. They're just people have to, you know, be organized in the right way. But I guess in the end, I still think it's worlds apart from the global situation. And though I think civil society can weaken and can strengthen at different points, and sometimes, of course, it can be strong, but you just get really bad things, even when so you get really bad civil society. That can happen too. I mean, democracy is not a guarantee of good things, because if the people become, you know, idiots, then you're going to get idiotic policy, and it does happen sometimes. But I mean, but it's better than having, you know, because, you know, in the case of a dictatorship, all you need is a dictator to be an idiot for a few days, and everything goes far apart. So, sorry, I mean, yeah. So now. So yeah, the Magna Carta as a contract, that's an intriguing idea. I mean, yeah, maybe there is something to that. I mean, is there?
I thought of it now, so I'm not sure about the details, the historical details. So I may be wrong. Some historian will tell me you don't know what you're talking about.
Right. The one thing that it does make me think of, and I think this is sort of in line with the tenor of your remarks, which and maybe with a lot of remarks here, there's this really nice paper by this guy, Robert Gooden, where he says, global democracy in the beginning. And you know, he says, well, you know, yeah, we don't have any democracy now, but maybe the situation we're in now is a little bit like the situation, say, under the Magna Carta, the development of institutions of rule of law and some participation of people, and, you know, maybe, you know, this is just a, you know, long-term process where we can see that develop. And I think, you know, there's something to that, and I think that's quite interesting. It's just the main thing I want to say about contracts is sort of under our sort of normal understanding of contracts as mutual advantage. It doesn't look like treaties. It doesn't look morally appropriate to say treaties are contracts, because they're, I think the moral function of treaties is very different from contracts. I mean, I developed this argument in some detail in the paper, but I'll say just a couple of words about it here. I hope I can. So the way I see it is that contract making, you know, again, where the prime focus is on each person pursuing their interests, makes sense only when you have what's sometimes called a moral division of labor, where, you know, individuals to some degree as individuals pursue their own interests, but then they expect a democratic political society to try to realize large-scale collective aims. Now, and there's good reason for this, because it's hard for me to make a contract and to have any serious effect on the justice of my society through my particular contract making. I can do that to some degree, maybe as a citizen, voting and grouping together with other people and voting and bringing political pressure on the legislature. But through the individual act of contract, it's just like a drop in the bucket. It doesn't have much significance. And since it's not only is it a drop, of course a vote is a drop in a bucket too, but the difference between a vote and a contract is votes are coordinated to have a tremendous collective impact. So everybody votes in this single process, and then you have this impact. Whereas with contracts, there's no coordination among different contract makers. And we don't really expect that for there to be such coordination. So it's acceptable that individuals make contracts for their own interest and then leave other issues to political questions. But I think in this respect, the position of states with regard to the global environment is very different from the position of individuals with regard to their membership in society. There are only about, well, there are a little less than 200 states in the world. And there are about, I don't know, 20 or 30 very wealthy states. The problem of coordination among those states is nothing like the problem of coordination even in a small state like Sweden, where you have 5 million people. And so some of the problems that lead us to think, oh, well, contracts should be directed towards individual interest, and we should, in some sense, leave things to the political society where we participate as individual citizens to solve that collective problem. Some of those problems are more likely can be solved by states acting together because they are a small number of them. And coordination among 200 people is just massively easier than coordination among 5 million or 300 million. So that's another reason why I think contracts and treaties are so different, because treaties there's really actually a possibility for states to make treaties that can actually realize public aims for the whole of the globe. And there have been some such treaty. The Ozone Treaty was a reasonable success in the 80s. Some of these trade treaties, in part, have been successful. You've got a relatively small number of people, basic entities involved in this process. So they can actually realize major public aims in ways that individuals acting in an uncoordinated fashion in a society cannot do. So now, of course, in the case of the Magna Carta, we have the nobles and the king. There too, you've got a fairly small group, and that's because power is so heavily concentrated in this small group of people. And so that may be an interesting, sort of in-between case. Yeah, good. In-group and out-group, right. Yeah, I agree with you that this is a major factor, the in-group, out-group phenomenon. So let me just state, so the position that I state as moral cosmopolitanism is this view that, well, there is no legitimate in-group, out-group, at least in terms of basic norms of justice. There's my family and there are my friends and, all that, it's okay to have some special relationships there and obligations and so on. But to say, oh, I should, Americans or Chileans should be, specially treated by me and not, South Asians or Africans is, ultimately I'm not convinced that that's morally legitimate. But I do recognize this as a psychological phenomenon. And that psychological phenomenon, I think, has to be, even though we can in some sense disapprove of it, it has to be negotiated in some sense. Now, there's a way in which the in-group, out-group phenomenon, it's got a negative side, but it also has a positive side. Because what the positive side is that a partial consequence of it is that you now have very large political societies that actually can function in a reasonably unified way. So you have, the United States, you have 300 million people. Or France, you have 65 million people. It's like, and partly that is because they just contrast themselves with other people. my hope is that in the long run, yeah, it will be, you know, the Martians. Well, no, I mean, ultimately, I think Martians are equals too, right? I mean, I mean, if they're rational beings, after all, then they're equals. I mean, just because they're not from Homo sapiens doesn't mean that, you know. But no, I recognize that, yeah, this is one of the major problems. I think, and I take your point too, because in a sense, I don't think I'm not thinking through that fact enough, I think, in this paper. I think that fact needs more reflection. It needs to be more integrated into this argument that I've developed. So thanks very much. That's very good.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left, but I want to try and squeeze in the last 3 questions. So maybe sunglasses.
Christy. I guess I wanted to turn the attention back to the global democracy system. I appreciate your conclusion that a true or a pure global democratic system could easily result in elite domination. And I think there are a number of other flaws as well with a global democratic system. And if we turn and look at the UN Parliamentary Assembly, which was proposed in 2007, I think that, you know, one of the major reasons why we've seen that really not get off the ground is because states have difficulty accepting that there could be somebody else other than states making decisions, and what state would be interested in agreeing to that. And a second concern, kind of spinning off of that, is once you have a system in place where states are accountable to somebody else, what would be encouraging a state, for example, like the U.S., to be paying any heed to it? And so I guess I agree with your conclusion that a pure democratic system right now would result in some very, very negative consequences. I'm wondering, however, about kind of an intermediary approach, particularly if we were to take a look again at the Parliamentary Assembly proposed by the UN. If we were to have representatives kind of elected by nations, and so they're still individuals, they're not an individual representing a nation on behalf of the government, but they are individuals kind of proposed or elected in whatever way the state wishes to have that happen, so that you have the states kind of agreeing with it, but then you still have kind of that individual nature. So you get around the difficulty with state consensus. You obviously still run into roadblocks with less democratic states.
Right.
Probably more roadblocks with them than with more democratic states, because you'd see the individuals reflecting more the opinions of the governments than of the people and the nations. Right. But I'm wondering, I guess, what your take is on this intermediary approach. We can't all of a sudden have a global democratic system just pop out of nowhere. So is there some type of intermediary step that you can see us taking between now and, you know, 2500?
Is the structure that you have in mind something like 2 houses where you've got representatives of individuals and then representatives of states?
Yes, I guess so.
Then making decisions that, yeah, they have to both meet majority rule or something, and then, yeah. I mean, I think that's an interesting way to do it. I mean, to some degree, of course, the U.S. Constitution was partly based on that, because on the thought that, you know, states didn't want to give up that much power to the federal government. And so they wanted representation of each state along with representation of individuals. So the Senate is like the first, and so one problem with the representation, though, of each state is if you have, say, equal representatives of China and I'm going to use an example that's so Liechtenstein or something like that, then there's a puzzle about how to think about how that representation is supposed to go. I mean, you could maybe think of that you could have proportional representation of each state. So each state sends a number of representatives proportionate to their size, and then you have this separate parliament that's based directly in constituencies. Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said for that. It's just and that would partly help with the permanent minorities issue, because once you require overlapping constituencies, it always ends up to be more than majority rule, essentially. So in the U.S., you've got to have a very large proportion agreeing to something in order to get something passed. I don't think it would resolve the problem, the civil society problem, though. Well, maybe it would in part, because you could say, well, it's a civil society within each state that can, in any case, mediate those state representatives. But the global sort of parliament, yeah, that wouldn't work so well for it. But yeah. I mean, I guess my thought. I mean, of course, if you had these assemblies decide by majority rule, then you would get cases where very large and populous states that are not democratic would dominate the system. So I suppose China, well, India would be kind of a counterbalance because it's fairly democratic. So that's an interesting idea. I mean, I have to think about that some more, though. My guess is that this is where this in-group, out-group stuff begins to loom large. There is this worry that I think part of the worry that states have with this kind of thing is, well, do we really want to be ruled by a majority that may be on the other side of the globe? Whose experiences are very different and so on. But I have to think about it some more. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. 2 questions. Jason?
Quite enjoyed your paper, and particularly your comments about treaties, and you rejected this sort of contractual notion. But your comments on justice led me to believe you're perhaps intimating some sort of constitutional notion. And I'm thinking of, say, the law of nations for Kant or peoples for Rawls, and then how that plays out in sort of human rights generally. And we get a bizarre situation, though. You sort of have something like a global constitution, but a rejection of global government. And I'm wondering if you could say any comments on that.
Well, some people think the UN is like that. So the UN Charter, some people describe it as a kind of global constitution. And that because now at least some people are arguing that the UN Constitution, UN Charter actually applies to everyone, whether they've signed on to the UN or not. And some people are disagreeing. There's some debate about this. Of course, if it applies to them, whether they've signed on to it or not, then then it really does begin to look like a constitution. But here's where the problem of global democracy comes back to haunt us. What's going on with the UN? I mean, what's the most powerful institution in the UN? It's the Security Council. That's the one that's dominated by the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain. The General Assembly, why doesn't that have power? Well, it's very simple. There was a certain point where the General Assembly started to act in ways that the United States didn't like. So I said, we're pushing you to the side. And the and the way they did it was really quite striking. And it was something you would never see in a political. Well, I don't think you'd see in a political society. Somebody would probably find a counterexample of this, but the U.S. just withheld its dues. The UN has, in the Charter, has requirements on due paying. The U.S. and, well, actually, the Soviet Union to some degree did this as well. The U.S. just withheld funds, and they withhold them when they don't like policy. And they withhold them until the policy changes. And then they give. Can you imagine somebody saying, I'm not going to pay my taxes until the law changes? I mean, some people say that, but I mean, but generally we don't pay attention to that. But in the case of the U.S., it did it openly. It said, no, we're not going to do that until you guys clean up your act, which means favor our interests. There it looks like you've got, even if there's some sense in which you've got some kind of shell of a constitution, there's a very, very heavy elite domination of the system. Because in some sense, the political order is still primarily an order of states. That, in a sense, that kind of is it's a version of the worry that I have about global democracy. And something like that would be highly likely to arise. And it's also a version of the idea that when we're thinking about the legitimacy of institutions, we have to look at what the basic structure of the global society is like, and what the basic players are, and how they function. And we got to construct a conception of legitimacy that proceeds from there to give us legitimate institutions. To ignore it is to imagine that one is creating a constitution, whereas in fact it's just a mask for power. Does that help?
Yeah. Okay, we have one last question.
Thank you very much. I have this question regarding probably the difference between outcomes and process, or outcomes and results. And I said to myself, what about if everybody around this table, it's wrong? And then after 500 years, when we're supposed to have this global democracy, or where the aliens come, we realize that probably we were wrong. Maybe we think we are right now, but we were going to be wrong maybe in 500 years. So I think that probably we should, or what we are doing probably is trying to understand this equation between democracy and global democracy and legitimacy, traveling through one highway. And I think we need to travel through parallel highways. And that's the difference between what I said, outcomes and the process. And I think that legitimation or legitimacy, it's mostly based at least on two factors. One is on an agreement about the institutions and about the jurisdiction of those who take decisions. So the notion of agreement and consent that you just elaborate before. And also based on the agreement related to the mechanisms for taking the decisions. So I think legitimacy is based on those issues more than on ethics and morals and other things. And therefore, I think that we can build legitimacy in a process, which is a political process. It's play at the level of politics, at the level of powers, at the level of transactions, at the levels of negotiations to achieve consent, or let's put it this way, to impose consent without imposing it. For me, the notion of hegemony. And therefore, I think that it's important probably to elucidate this dilemma or those difficulties, because they're going to be ongoing, is the need to, we need necessarily to separate, at least at the analytical level, what I had here is the reference that we have, the target, in this case, values, ethics, global democracy, which is one thing, and at the other level, the mechanism and the process. Because we cannot put those things together, we are not going to resolve the equation. I don't know if I'm clear.
Yeah, yeah. So, so let me. So my thought is that we can try to sort of provide a kind of moral justification for certain kinds of mechanisms of decision making on the basis of sort of moral principles. So I wasn't sure with the opposition that you were.
If we agree on something around this table,
Yeah.
it becomes legitimate. But it doesn't mean it's morally or immoral, but it's legitimate. Now, who is the one who's going to judge if it's immoral?
Oh, I see. Okay, good. So let me just, let me just make a plea for morality here. I mean, the thought is, if when you say, if we agree around the table, it's legitimate,
Yeah.
I think that in some sense, that does give it some kind of moral vindication.
Yeah, I agree with this. Yeah, that's the notion of democracy, and the way you take that.
Yeah, yeah. But I think you're right that, I mean, my idea, and I think this is what you're pointing to as well. I mean, the idea of legitimacy is to try to come up with a decision which has a kind of moral vindication, even though people may not agree always. And furthermore, the decision could be morally legitimate, but still wrong.
Yeah.
And those are compatible descriptions. That's what I think democracy is about. I mean, democracies presumably make lots of wrong decisions. I mean, hopefully they're not massively wrong. I mean, not like the genocide in Rwanda or something like that, but they make bad decisions. But the thought is something like, and it's highly likely that they're going to make bad decisions because there's so many people who disagree, you know, either half these people are wrong or everybody's wrong. So presumably they're going to, the decisions are going to often be mistaken in various ways. But as long as they can participate as equals, it has a kind of moral legitimacy. So you can look at every decision from two dimensions. One is the legitimacy of the process by which it was brought about. The other one is an independent assessment of its moral value or its justice. Now, of course, each citizen, as they participate in a democratic process, is thinking about the different policies or different candidates or whatever in terms of whether they think one is more just than the other. But then if they, to the extent that they accept democratic decisions, even when the decision goes against what they believe, and thus they think it's wrong, they might think, well, because it was done in an reasonably egalitarian way, I'm going to go along with it. So, so morality comes in at two different points there. One is to ground legitimacy, the other one is the outcome. And legitimacy is important precisely because we're fallible, we have a lot of disagreement, a lot of uncertainty, but we still want to make decisions that's in some sense morally desirable. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's end there. And please join me in thanking Professor.
Thank you for your question. Thank you.